academic perspective and also from a personal perspective that protests are rational expressions of politics,
Mm-hmm.
right? And we have in this country different ways of expressing our politics. Now, some people would prefer that it occur within more conventional forms of politics as opposed to these extra institutional kind of approaches. However, when those institutional approaches as a political strategy become unavailable, then one has to find alternative ways of expressing oneself. So I think that protests can be helpful as part of a political strategy, right? Because protests are about cultural issues as well as these kind of classic economic and political issues that some people are a little bit more comfortable with. What I would argue is that protest is important for moving conversation. We saw that in the 1960s. But I would also argue that in addition to protest, we need a multi-pronged approach using all types of political strategies. And so I see protest as a way of opening up and maybe drawing people in, because that's the value of protest, is to draw people into, for lack of a better term, the fight. And once you can draw people in and hold them there, you can expand the scope of the fight, and then ask individuals who might not necessarily participate in more traditional forms of politics to also participate in those types of politics. Individuals who might not necessarily understand the need for protest, if they're really curious, can ask, and therefore it offers an opportunity for an education around this kind of why it is that becomes a viable political strategy for those who are oftentimes excluded from more traditional political realms.
Now, Dr. King, we agreed on the phone earlier today, is probably amongst the two most co-opted sources of both political and religious philosophy. If there's the Bible and Dr. King are both, let's just say, co-opted, divided for an individual's political perspective as it is convenient. Would you agree?
Yes, I agree.
Okay. So Dr. King spoke, in a reflection of what's going on in Baltimore and a reflection of what's going on a much more milder basis here in Providence and some of the cities in the Northeast. Dr. King spoke to and I'll paraphrase what he called about the evils of moderation. The establishment political causes solely extricate Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence and use that, in my opinion, as sort of a political roadblock to any form of non-moderate, non-conventional within the system protest. If you could speak to Dr. King's true philosophy as opposed to that which has been selectively analyzed by the short attention span media here in this country.
Sometimes I chuckle. Dr. King, by some, was seen as a radical because he did talk about this curse of moderation, where he argued, to expect Black people to wait and to participate in a system that has yet to let them in is problematic. And oftentimes that element of Dr. King is left out of our conversation of Dr. King, right? The element where he says, yes, we can engage in nonviolent protest, but he also recognizes that power will never concede power. And I think that's the part that troubles people. And that's why he sometimes is selectively used, and put it that way.
If I could just read a one or two line quote, from Dr. King, if peace means accepting second-class citizenship, I don't want it. If peace means keeping my mouth shut in the midst of injustice and evil, I don't want it. If peace means being complacently adjusting to a deadening status quo, I don't want peace. It strikes me that a number of the people that we've interviewed lately, whether it be DARE, Progressive Democrats, those folks who are sort of stirring up from the stupor of everyday political thought, seem to be realizing that in my world we have a saying, don't mistake my kindness for weakness. Do you have any suggestions to young folks in the city right now, particularly in urban areas, where they're facing violence on all levels. They're facing violence from within the community. They're facing violence from authority figures on a day-to-day basis. There's a suppression of their civil rights, whether it be everything from stop and frisk to the more subtle suppression of their economic rights through hiring practices, through redlining, things like that. Do you have, as someone who's an academic yet who works intimately with some of the young and best and brightest students in this country, what advice do you have?
I think part of the advice that I have, and I'm going to say this, that I always struggle with these types of issues in terms of how do we move forward kind of thing. How does one exist in a context that promotes rejection of one's human beingness? So what types of advice? One of the first things I tell my students to do is not take people's word, but to do your own original research. Because, as you mentioned, we advocate this notion of Martin Luther King Jr. as this peaceful person, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you read Martin Luther King Jr., there's a lot of things in his speeches, in his writings, that suggest that he'd had another understanding of peace. And his understanding of peace was one where justice was met. I think people think that one can be peaceful and then somehow justice is going to materialize. But if you really dig deep at Martin Luther King Jr., that's not what he's saying. So that's where I always tell individuals that I'm teaching or anybody I'm talking to is to go read. Take a moment to really study what these people are saying, because sometimes what they're saying is a lot more complex than you can actually get in a soundbite.
Interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, in your own personal life, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up. It was interesting. I read about your upcoming appearance in the Providence Journal at this morning's NAAC brunch, and when I was looking to refresh the article in my own mind this morning, it was replaced by yet a more disturbing take on the news. You yourself are a successful academician at a major American university, which is by no means in any part of it's in a part of the city that one would never confuse with being in the quote-unquote hood in any sort of difficult circumstances. Quite frankly, Providence College exists within a more upper-middle-class portion of the city of Providence. Yet you yourself has been the object of racial profiling on on a number of occasions. And tell us about that, and as someone who doesn't have to deal with that, does in fact that put the lie to the notion that if you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to worry about?
Yes, I have endured many of an encounter with being racially profiled. And I chuckled when you asked the question because what I often say to people is there's this notion of good and bad. And oftentimes the response that I get is, and it's a subtle kind of response, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the security guards, they're good people, they're well-intentioned. And I always ask, so then what does that mean? And how exactly, if they're among the good, because when I report these incidences and you're telling me they're good, then automatically you're also telling me that maybe I'm not.
Right.
Right? So then exactly what makes me bad? And what I argue that it's, social class, social location, education, and the whole nine does not protect Black and brown bodies from these kind of racial aggressive actions,
mm-hmm.
racially motivated actions, right? And so what it's a very kind of sad reality to confront on a personal level, but also on a very kind of academic level is, well, if we do what society tells us to do, then why does this happen? And it's that realization that, it has to be race, right? And then you realize there's nothing you can do to protect yourself from race because you are the race you are.
Right.
And this morning I was watching the news, and there was a mother on the news in Baltimore, and I thought she was so profound. And she said, how do you tell your child to behave differently when they've not done anything wrong?
Wow.
How do you correct that behavior when they've not done anything wrong? And that's how racism functions. It makes no distinction between who's good and who's bad.
And in a sense, isn't that a just, when you look back to some of the comments of the mayor of New York, Mayor de Blasio, who on most issues I would probably politically disagree with, but when faced with he was vilified faced with the choice of raising a young biracial man in New York City, which is clearly a very challenged area, with regard to everything from stop and frisk to just overall the tenor of law enforcement and some of the obvious results in the city. What do you say to your son or daughter, but particularly to your young son, for whom it would appear a certain segment of law enforcement will have placed, in fact, a target on their back, regardless of their individual behavior? As a parent, what do you do?
As a parent, I'm raising a little black girl, and it is a challenge. It is a challenge to figure out how to tell her. And, I've helped raise my male cousins in New York City, and it's a challenge. So what we as a family ended up doing for younger cousins is basically to try to teach them how not to respond. But as we've seen, sometimes even in silence, harm is caused. And so, honestly, and it's funny, I was talking to my grandmother earlier this week. My grandmother's in her 80s, and we have concluded the only thing that we can do is pray. Because all of the tactics that we thought we knew could work seem not to work.
So to all of those, and a question raised by my co-host in a blog this week, which has already aroused some controversy, where he kind of looked at the news media coverage of insurrections, riots, disturbances, civil outrage in other parts of the country, which our media would then, I think, fairly correctly label as being patriotic to diplomacy and democracy in that home nation. We then turn, as a media and as a culture, and focus on the negativity surrounding some of the very same style of protests that occur here in the United States for, quite frankly, many would argue, a lot of the same reasons. How do you explain that dichotomy? Is it just simply we're not willing to look within ourselves and see some of the issues facing the inner city?
I think that's part of it. Because when one looks at the functioning of race, then it's hard to say, how am I participating in racism? And I always tell students that, there's what we call active racism, and then there's also passive racism. And most people cannot, they like to think more of the active racism. But most people don't like to really think of how they themselves are participating in the more passive forms of racism. That's a really hard, bitter pill to swallow. And I think that's what makes it difficult. The other issue, I think, has to do with an issue, this is a long-standing issue within the Black community, this notion of citizenship. Who belongs? Who has a right to speak? Right? And I think when we look at these Black rebellions that are, is not to get too academic, but they're very historical in nature. And sometimes we like to think of the 1960s as this kumbaya moment where people sang and held hands in prayer, but that also had these moments of eruption.
Right.
So there's a history of doing this. And I think in Invisible Man, Ralph Ellison handles this really, really well when he talks about not being able to be seen. And not being able to be seen is really a question of citizenship and belonging. And so I think this is my kind of interpretation of the response to these more recent rebellions in this very long history of the Black Civil Rights Movement. But in the post-1960s, what I think is happening here with the reporting, and it's kind of buried in it, is really, do these people have a right to speak?
Is that why perhaps a lot of the live reporting, particularly from Fox News, seems to be directed towards more of the sensationalist aspects, to the property damage that's incurred, as opposed to the actual substance underlying the complaint?
Yep, exactly. Because when you focus on the so-called property damage, you